The man suspected of committing a string of brutal murders in Colorado in the 80s was in court today. Alex Ewing is accused of attacking and killing the Bennett family in Aurora with a hammer.
It started as an ordinary night, a family tucked safely in their beds, a home filled with warmth and love. But by morning, the walls of their suburban house were dripping with horror. A brutal massacre. No forced entry. No clear motive. Just blood, silence, and a mystery that would haunt investigators for decades. How does an entire family go from celebrating a child's birthday to being slaughtered in their own home? Who could commit such unspeakable violence, and vanish without a trace? For over 34 years, these questions tormented a community desperate for answers. The case grew colder with each passing year, leaving behind only grief, speculation, and a single survivor too young to remember the night that changed everything. But then, in a shocking turn of events, DNA technology unearthed a name, a man whose past was as violent as the crime itself. When justice finally arrived, it was more chilling than anyone could have imagined. Before we uncover the terrifying truth behind this case, make sure to like this video and subscribe, where we expose the darkest secrets buried in history. Bruce and Deborah Bennett were the kind of couple people admired. They had built something beautiful, brick by brick, dream by dream. A love story rooted in devotion, responsibility, and an unshakable commitment to family. They had it all, a happy marriage, 2 beautiful daughters, and a promising future. Bruce was born in 1956, growing up in a close-knit household with his brothers, Richard and Daniel. Their childhood was filled with the little moments that made a family, fighting over the remote, sharing inside jokes, and playing in the backyard until the sun dipped below the horizon. As he grew older, Bruce became known for his intelligence, his quiet determination, and his steady presence. He joined the Navy, where he honed his skills as a sonar analyst, a job that required patience, discipline, and precision, qualities that defined him in every aspect of his life. Deborah had a different kind of strength. As the eldest of 4 children, she learned early on what it meant to carry the weight of responsibility. When their mother passed away, Deborah became more than just a big sister, she became a second mother, the one who made sure her siblings were fed, comforted, and cared for. She had a heart that never hesitated to put others first, a nurturing spirit that made her the perfect match for Bruce. Their love story began through Deborah's brother, Larry. From the moment Bruce and Deborah met, something just clicked. They understood each other in a way that went beyond words. They knew what it meant to put family first, to build something bigger than themselves. It wasn't just love, it was partnership, respect, and an unspoken promise to always stand by each other. That promise only deepened as their family grew. In 1976, they welcomed their first daughter, Melissa, a bright-eyed little girl who instantly became the center of their world. 5 years later, in 1981, Vanessa was born, completing their perfect family. By 1983, Bruce and Deborah had taken another big step toward their future, moving to Aurora, Colorado. They had dreams of stability, success, and a life filled with love, so they opened a family furniture business, working side by side to provide for their children and build the kind of future they had always wanted. Everything was falling into place. January 15, 1984, was a day of pure joy. It was Melissa's 8th birthday, a night filled with laughter, balloons, and the kind of happiness only childhood can hold. Family gathered, celebrating the little girl who had brought so much light into their lives. Bruce's mother, Constance, whom everyone lovingly called Corny, was there, along with Bruce's brother. They laughed, they ate, they embraced each other as they said their goodbyes, never knowing it would be for the last time. As the evening wound down and the guests departed, the Bennett family settled in for the night, unaware that the warmth of that celebration would soon be replaced by unimaginable horror. Later that night, a neighbor called, a small gesture, a minor detail, someone had noticed that the Bennett's garage door had been left open. It was the kind of thing most people wouldn't even remember the next morning. Just a tiny moment. A passing detail. But that small moment, would become the last normal thing before everything changed forever. January 16, 1984, started like any other winter morning in Aurora, Colorado, cold, quiet, and still. But for the Bennett family, time had already stopped. At their small family-owned furniture business, the doors remained locked, the lights off, and the phone unanswered. Bruce and Deborah Bennett were never late. They were responsible, punctual, never the kind of people to simply not show up without a call. As the morning stretched on with no sign of them, Bruce's mother, Constance "Corny" Bennett, felt the first pang of unease. She called their home, but the phone rang and rang. No answer. Maybe they had overslept. Maybe they were out running errands. But deep down, something didn't feel right. By 10 a.m., unease turned into dread. Corny couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. She grabbed her keys and drove to their house, the familiar journey now clouded with an unfamiliar sense of fear. The Bennett's home was a picture of suburban comfort, modest yet warm, a place that reflected the love and care Bruce and Deborah had poured into it. But as Corny pulled into the driveway, something immediately set her on edge. The garage door was slightly ajar, just enough to make her pause. Hadn't someone mentioned it being open the night before? She stepped out of her car and approached the front door, knocking lightly at first, then harder. Silence. She tried the doorknob. It turned. The moment she stepped inside, the cold air from outside seemed to follow her in, as if the house itself had been drained of warmth. And then, she saw him. Bruce lay at the foot of the staircase, motionless. At first, Corny thought he had fallen, maybe suffered an accident in the night. But as she moved closer, the truth came into horrifying focus. His body was twisted unnaturally, his throat slashed so deeply that it nearly severed his head. Blood had pooled beneath him, dark and thick, staining the carpet in a way that told her this was no accident. This was something else. Something worse. Her scream echoed through the empty house, but no one was left to hear it. Shaking, she stumbled forward, calling out for Deborah. For the girls. Maybe they were hiding. Maybe they were hurt but still alive. Maybe. But the nightmare had only just begun. Upstairs, the bedroom door stood open. The bed where Bruce and Deborah should have been sleeping was instead soaked in crimson. Deborah lay lifeless, her body broken and brutalized. She had been sexually assaulted before being murdered in her own bed. The very space that had once been a sanctuary for her family had become a crime scene, defiled in the most monstrous way imaginable. And then, there was Melissa. Just hours earlier, she had been celebrating her 8th birthday, laughing, blowing out candles, surrounded by the love of her family. Now, she was gone. Her small body bore the same horrifying marks of violence. The innocence of childhood snuffed out by an evil so incomprehensible that Corny could hardly process the sight in front of her. But in the midst of the devastation, there was something unexpected. A sound. A faint, whimpering cry. Vanessa. The 3-year-old was still alive. Barely. She had been beaten, her tiny skull fractured, but she was breathing. She had somehow survived the nightmare that had claimed the rest of her family. By the time the police arrived, the home had transformed into something beyond human comprehension, a house of horrors, a graveyard where an entire family had been slaughtered in their sleep. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and every room told a story of unspeakable violence. Investigators moved methodically through the house, piecing together what little evidence they could find. A small knife was discovered outside, half buried in the snow, its blade coated in blood. They believed it had been used to slit Bruce's throat. But the primary weapon, a hammer, was nowhere to be found. The killer had taken it with them, leaving behind nothing but destruction and unanswered questions. No forced entry. No clear motive. No witnesses. The crime stunned the community. How could something like this happen in a quiet suburban neighborhood, in a home where love had flourished? The brutality of the attack suggested deep, personal rage, but there was no indication that the Bennetts had enemies. No debts. No shady dealings. Just a hard-working couple, their 2 young daughters, and a future that had been torn away in a single night. With limited forensic technology in 1984, investigators found themselves grasping at straws. No fingerprints. No fibers. No DNA to analyze. The only thing left behind was fear, the lingering, suffocating terror that a killer was still out there. Days passed. Then weeks. Then months. Leads dried up. The case grew cold. And the question that haunted everyone remained, who could do this? And why? The Bennett house was no longer a home. It stood as a silent tomb, a place where love had once lived but where horror had taken over in a single night. The crime scene had been cleaned. The bodies buried. But for those who survived, the nightmare never ended. For Constance "Corny" Bennett, the images of that morning never faded. She had gone to check on her family, expecting to find them running late, maybe catching up on some extra sleep. Instead, she walked straight into hell. Bruce, her son, lay at the bottom of the stairs, his body brutalized, his throat slashed. Further inside, she found Deborah, lifeless in their bedroom, and little Melissa, her bright young life stolen in the most horrific way imaginable. It was a vision burned into her mind, a torment that would visit her every time she closed her eyes. For years, she was unable to sleep, haunted by the memory of that blood-soaked house, by the silence that had replaced the laughter of a family that should have still been alive. And then there was Vanessa, the only survivor. Just 3 years old. A tiny, broken body in a hospital bed, her face swollen beyond recognition, her skull fractured by the same monster who had slaughtered the rest of her family. She had survived, but at what cost? The parents who had loved her, the sisters she had played with, the warmth and safety of a home, gone. Stolen from her before she was even old enough to understand what she had lost. She was raised by her grandmother and her aunt, growing up in the long shadow of a tragedy she couldn't remember but could never escape. The world knew what had happened to her. Strangers whispered her name in hushed voices, speaking about the little girl who had lived through something unthinkable. But Vanessa had no memories of that night, no recollection of her parents' faces, no warmth of their voices, no mental image of her sister's smile. Just an emptiness where they should have been. As she got older, the weight of that void became unbearable. She struggled with PTSD, with fear, with trust. The world had proven itself to be cruel before she was even old enough to speak in full sentences. How was she supposed to believe it could ever be kind? At 18, Vanessa became a mother herself. Just 3 months after giving birth to her son, she lost custody of him. Another piece of her stolen away. It seemed as though the Bennett family was cursed, every generation haunted by loss, by suffering, by things beyond their control. For decades, the case remained a cold, unsolved mystery. The killer had vanished, leaving behind nothing but blood and grief. The world had moved on. But for Vanessa, for Corny, for the loved ones left behind, the wounds never healed. And then, out of nowhere, after more than 30 years of silence, everything changed. An unexpected breakthrough. A name. A face. Justice had been a ghost for decades. But now, finally, it was coming. And when the truth was revealed, it was more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. For 34 years, the Bennett family massacre remained a mystery, an unsolved horror buried beneath decades of dead-end leads and unanswered questions. The world had changed. New families moved into the quiet Aurora neighborhood, unaware of the blood-soaked history of the house on East Center Drive. Time had marched forward, but for those left behind, the pain never faded. The case had gone cold, like so many others. And then, in 2018, everything changed. It was a quiet night in July when a group of detectives sat at their desks, sifting through paperwork, chasing ghosts, and wondering if justice would ever come. Then, at exactly 9:15 p.m., a notification appeared. A Cody's hit. A match. The kind of alert that could change everything. The name that appeared on the screen sent a shockwave through the team: Alex Christopher Ewing. Ewing was no shadowy figure who had simply disappeared after the crime. He wasn't a ghost that had slipped away into the unknown. He had been in plain sight the entire time, sitting behind bars in a Nevada prison, serving time for a crime so brutal it mirrored the Bennett family's fate. In August 1984, just months after the Bennett murders, Ewing had attempted to kill another man, bludgeoning him with a rock during a home invasion. He had been caught, arrested, and locked away, but back then, DNA technology was still in its infancy. The connection between him and the Colorado bloodbath had gone undetected. For over 3 decades, he rotted in prison for one crime, never knowing that one day, science would catch up with him. When detectives arrived at the prison to confront him, Ewing played his part well. He feigned ignorance, tilting his head as if hearing the name Bennett for the first time. He denied everything, claiming he had no idea what they were talking about. But then, they showed him the evidence, the DNA match. The undeniable truth. The act crumbled. His face changed. His breathing grew shallow. He had spent 34 years hiding behind the walls of his cell, convinced he had gotten away with it. But now, the monster had been unmasked. For the families who had suffered, for Vanessa, for Corny, for the people who had lived with the horror of an unsolved case, the truth had finally come. But justice was not just about uncovering a name. It was about making sure the man responsible for so much pain never walked free again. The wheels of justice turned slowly, agonizingly so. Decades had passed since the night of unimaginable horror, but for the survivors, the wounds had never healed. Now, in 2021, the moment they had been waiting for had finally arrived. Alex Ewing, the man who had haunted their nightmares, the faceless monster who had stolen an entire family, was finally standing trial. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with emotion. The gallery was filled with those who had waited 37 long years for justice, family members, investigators, reporters who had followed the case from the beginning. And among them sat Vanessa Bennett, the only surviving member of the family Ewing had tried to erase. She was no longer the helpless child left beaten and broken in that house. She was a grown woman now, a survivor, sitting just feet away from the man who had destroyed her life. Ewing, clad in his prison uniform, sat expressionless. His face, aged by time, bore no remorse, no flicker of guilt. He listened in silence as prosecutors laid out the gruesome details of the crimes he had committed so many years ago. The DNA evidence. The brutality. The shattered lives left in his wake. Witness after witness took the stand. Investigators recounted the scene of the crime: Bruce Bennett, found near the staircase, his throat slit, his body battered beyond recognition. Deborah, violated and murdered in their bedroom. Melissa, just 8 years old, slaughtered. And then Vanessa, the 3-year-old who had survived the unthinkable. Vanessa did not testify. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was enough to shake the room. Her trembling hands clutched a tissue, her eyes locked on the man who had stolen her family. She had no memory of that night, but the scars he left were more than just physical. They had shaped her entire life. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was suffocating. The jury foreperson stood, clearing their throat. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A ripple of emotion spread through the courtroom. Some gasped. Some cried. Vanessa closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she had been holding for 37 years. Alex Ewing was sentenced to multiple life terms. He would never walk free again. And yet, even as he faced his fate, he refused to show remorse. He never spoke. Never apologized. Never admitted to the horrors he had inflicted. But it didn't matter anymore. Justice had finally been served. For Vanessa, for her family, for an entire community haunted by this crime, the nightmare was over. Justice had finally been served, but for Vanessa Bennett, the battle was far from over. The conviction of Alex Ewing had given her answers, had put a name and a face to the monster who had shattered her family. But no verdict, no sentence, not even life behind bars, could bring back what she had lost. In 2022, she faced him once more. Another case, another murder. This time, it was Patricia Smith, a woman brutally killed just days before Vanessa's family. The same violence. The same unspeakable cruelty. And once again, the DNA evidence left no doubt, Alex Ewing was guilty. Vanessa sat in court as the sentence was handed down. Another life term. Another confirmation that this man would never be free again. But even as she watched him be led away in shackles, there was no sense of victory. Justice had been served, but justice was not the same as healing. For most of her life, Vanessa had been running, from the past, from the pain, from the ghosts that followed her at every turn. She had fallen into addiction, lost her way, lost herself. She had been a mother without the tools to mother, a woman unable to outrun the trauma etched into her bones. But something changed. Maybe it was seeing her family's killer finally pay for what he had done. Maybe it was realizing that she had survived for a reason. Whatever it was, Vanessa made a choice. She chose to fight. Today, she is clean. She is rebuilding, not just herself, but her relationships, her future. She is working to mend the bonds with her children, to prove that trauma does not have to be a life sentence. That she is more than the little girl left for dead in that house. More than the pain, more than the past. Vanessa Bennett is living proof that survivors are not defined by what was done to them. They are defined by how they rise. And after nearly 4 decades of darkness, Vanessa is finally stepping into the light. The Bennett family massacre is more than just a horrifying crime, it is a devastating reminder of how one night, one act of unimaginable violence, can leave ripples of pain that last a lifetime. A family full of love and promise was destroyed in an instant, leaving behind only memories, grief, and a single survivor to carry the weight of the past. For 34 years, the truth remained buried. A monster walked free while those who loved Bruce, Deborah, and Melissa were left with nothing but questions and nightmares. But time has a way of uncovering even the darkest secrets. And when forensic science finally caught up, when justice finally knocked on Alex Ewing's door, the world learned what Vanessa had lived with her entire life: monsters are real. But this case is not just about the horror of what happened, it's about resilience. It's about a young girl who lost everything and still found the strength to keep going. Vanessa's journey is proof that survival is not just about escaping death, it's about learning how to live again. It makes you wonder, if forensic technology had been more advanced in 1984, could this have all been prevented? Could Alex Ewing have been caught before he ever stepped foot in the Bennett's home? How many lives could have been saved, and for survivors like Vanessa, how do you find healing when your entire past has been written in blood? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this case shocked you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. There are countless untold stories waiting to be uncovered, stories of love, betrayal, and the darkest corners of human nature. And sometimes, those stories are closer than we think.